Okay, right off the bat, I am an anti-fascist. I am criticizing the anti-fascist movement to make it better. No, you're anti-Antifa, that makes you pro-fa. I'm trying to make it better. Step away from the keyboards. Hear me out.
Hitler has only got one Bulgari, as to the very small. Hitler has something similar, a core of rebels as the balls at all.
I'm a feminist and an anti-fascist, and I want the anti-fascist movement to be feminist instead of one yielding to the other. As it sits, Antifa, a social group not entirely the same thing as general anti-fascism, is predominantly macho and takes the stance that feminism is weak and not to be totally embraced at best, and fascist collaboration at worst, and must step aside while the big strong men handle it by punching people in the face. Or as German Antifa says, on the mouth. When feminists complain about this militaristic attitude, in line with toxic masculinity, there is an idea in people's minds that this means that white liberal women want to feel empowered through passively supporting fascism. Therefore, feminism that doesn't step aside and let macho Antifa do what they want is perceived as problematic. Fasci. Macho Antifa puts forward the idea that because they stand against Nazis, if you oppose them in any way, that makes you a fascist. Anti-Antifa being pro-fa fascist. To complicate things, there are a lot of actual fascists running around, trying to get people poised against the anti-fascist movement through demonizing Antifa as some kind of terrorist organization. So it's also reasonable to be on guard for manipulative rhetoric. However, macho Antifa has also poisoned people against the honest feminist criticism of their behavior, slurring it as fascism, which unfortunately makes mainstream Antifa hostile to feminism. I'm endorsing fantifa, the combination of feminism and Antifa that macho Antifa doesn't want you to know about. This is one of their symbols. It is a combination of the Antifa flag and the purple anarcha-feminist flag. This is the context in which I criticize macho Antifa, not pro-fa, but pro-Antifa, and anti-bad actors within it who are demonstrating toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is detrimental to the movement. It must be removed to make the movement stronger. The future is female and no pasaran. Face him like a man, son. As a man, is being a feminist a priority to you? Do you see being a feminist as revolutionary or radical? Do you think that you define what is radical? Do you suffer from or contribute to macho bravado or subpoena envy? i.e., defining a true or cool and respectable activist as someone who has been arrested, done lockdowns, scaled walls, hung banners, done time for their actions, argued or fought with police, done property alterations, beat up Nazi boneheads, etc. All men need to work on issues of patriarchy, sexism, and misogyny. However, this questionnaire may point out to you areas of particular focus or concentration for your own anti-patriarchal/sexist/misogynist process and development. Anonymous member of Chicago Anarcho-Feminists from Are You a Manarchist? Questionnaire, published in Anarcho-Feminist Manifesto, 1971. Does anyone remember that the leftists used to be pacifists and the rightists used to advocate solving conflict through violence? I know it's hard to remember politics from a week ago, let alone 10, 15 years ago, but I assure you this used to be a thing. It was primarily a conflict scene between feminists and the men's rights activists, where feminists would preach raising sons to resolve disputes peacefully, and MRA saw that as a threat to manhood itself. If a young man can't punch a bully in the face and get him to back off, is he even a man? Or is it a sissy?
I finally told my dad. You know what he said? He said, be a man. Just pop him in the mouth once, son, and he'll back off. So I did. I popped him. Nora sent me to the hospital. You want to know what my dad said then?
What?
He said he wished he'd had a son.
This is what we would call toxic masculinity. The idea that manhood is defined by the ability to gain social dominance through violence. This is often associated with misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia, where men believe that women are inherently lesser, see the lack of male ability to dominate through violence as a sign of femininity, and attempt to reinforce these traditional notions of masculinity through brutally dominating lesser effeminate men, sissies, pussies, girly men. This leads to bullying, sexual assault, and murder. Feminists recognize it as a social problem. I remember a time when the worst takes were made about fictional villains being bad role models for young boys. There was this one video about how Gaston was a bad role model that got really popular on feminist sites. The Gaston song was taken at face value as preaching about Gaston as the paragon of masculinity for beating everyone up and being a threatening muscle man. Syndrome, the supervillain of The Incredibles, was particularly horrifying to some people because he explained his rationale of threatening people because it earned him respect. This would be tempting for young boys to emulate, apparently. Satire was too much for some people, as was trusting the audience to recognize bad ways of thinking. These ideas were born of socialistic, pacifistic idealism, leftists envisioning a world in which violence is no longer necessary, as is tied into the opposition of capitalism as a violent framework, but they were also popular with liberals who wanted to push such ideological idealism within the capitalistic framework, representing a rare point of agreement across the leftist political spectrum. These were bad takes, but came from a good place. I'd say that the media items were actually good because they opposed toxic masculinity by associating it with the bad guys, and, again, trusting the audience to judge that the villains are wrong for thinking that way. The general ideals of pacifism were fairly ubiquitous, left of center right, and leftists were fairly united in opposing toxic masculinity. And then this happened.
Neo-Nazis love you, but you're not a neo-Nazi.
Neo-Nazis don't love me. They kind of hate me,
Following
actually.
the KKK, neo-Nazi.
Those people don't like me,
Are you
to be
like
honest.
the hipster version of the neo-Nazi movement?
It's, Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
On January 20th, 2017, a Black Bloc protester, an anti-fascist obscuring his identity in black clothing, punched prominent neo-Nazi Richard Spencer in the face. Hashtag #AlwaysPunchNazis started trending, and leftists became united in promoting violent social domination in this particular case, with a Nazi. The leftist equivalent of a pedophile in the sense of a boogeyman that lets you throw a purge night. Rightists suddenly started broadcasting the idea that they've always been pacifists, while evil leftists think that this behavior is appropriate, and in the face of this opposition, leftists started embracing the idea that it's good and just to punch people in the face to assert social dominance, with Nazis. This line of thinking is old. It comes straight from the opposition of the original fascists in the 1920s and 30s, when everybody had fistfights in the streets. It was a prominent facet of Weimar Germany, where people would form these gangs based on political ideology and have public brawls, even escalating to all-out gunfights. This went on with all sorts of ideologies, while the Communist Party dedicated a specific wing to specifically fight fascists. Antifascistische Aktion, anti-fascist action, or Antifa for short. Antifa punched Nazis in the streets of Germany and sent people into other countries to lead anti-fascists to carry out similar brawls. English Antifa fought the black shirts of the fascist party, as was dramatized in popular crime drama Peaky Blinders, and American Antifa fought the American Nazis of the German-American Bund, which wasn't out of place because everyone just had public brawls then. It was just what men did. If a man didn't like the way another man looked at him, an implicit threat of violence, he'd settle it with a fist fight to impose dominance. This was effective enough at the time, with the values of the time. Fascists were frightened into retreating from the public eye, with some moderate success. Of course, they were also fighting anti-fascists and scaring them as much as they could. That was just what men did. They proved their dominance in a brawl. Shades of Gaston.
Every guy here'd love to be you, Gaston!
A notable anti-fascist effort in 1940 was when Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, two Jewish men, created Captain America, a superhero who punches Hitler in the face. Kirby and Simon were not affiliated with the Antifa movement at all. They had no correspondence with members of Antifa as far as I know. They were just part of the cultural zeitgeist where fascism was opposed with a punch to the face to assert dominance. They can be labeled as anti-fascist and shoehorned into Antifa if you want to label every single instance of anti-fascism as such, which is sometimes useful and sometimes confusing. A popular anecdote tells of some Nazi youths who showed up at the comic book company and demanded that Jack Kirby show himself so that they could beat him up. However, Kirby was a tough, working-class, manly man, rolled up his sleeves, and went to beat them up instead. It turned out that the Nazis were all bark, no bite, and they turned tail and ran. It's a story that celebrates masculine prowess and the ability to assert dominance through threat of violence. I was a young man. The only real politics I knew was if a guy liked Hitler, I'd beat the stuffing out of him, and that would be it. Jack Kirby, The Comics Journal, 1990.
They said hello in a language the Klingons understood. Violence brought respect. Respect brought peace.
Why do people eat this stuff up? They don't like Nazis? Sure. But they also can get behind the idea of a big, strong man asserting violence for the cause. That is in line with the toxic masculine values they were raised with. Jewish men then and now push against a historical characterization of being too androgynous to be considered real men. European Gentiles held the perception of Jewish men as, to use a Yiddish term, nebbish, submissive and effeminate, while Jewish women were considered butch and manlike, dominating Jewish men in the household. The circumcision ritual was perceived as a feminization of a baby boy, transforming a penis into the semblance of a clitoris that bleeds in the semblance of menstruation. This idea was widespread enough that the word Jew became slang for a woman's clitoris, and blood libel, the idea that Jews would kidnap Christian children to drink their blood vampirically, was attributed to the Jewish men needing to replenish their blood after menstruating it away. This served to other the Jewish people and was connected to the idea of Jews being forced into ghettos, being considered subhuman for not being proper men, and thus deserving ostracization in the Gentile perception. This led into the Zionist movement as a means by which Jewish men could assert their masculinity, with a figure called the New Jew, or Muscle Jew, a macho manly man under the Gentile standards for gender, to populate Israel and make it strong. In some ways, Zionism can be considered a Jewish equivalent to the predominantly Gentile Antifa movement. It arose in response to the Dreyfus Affair at the turn of the 20th century, which inspired widespread anti-Semitic hatred throughout Europe, similar to a proto-Nazism. The idea behind Zionism was that Jews would gather in their ancestral homeland in such numbers that anti-Semites would hesitate before threatening them.
Say, let's pretend this grain is a puny little
Jew.
Did that hurt?
Nope.
Well, how about this one? Are you kidding? Well, how about this?
This manifested with two faces. One centered on building something and being communal, with only the threat of being able to fight back if threatened. And the other based around toxic masculinity, with Jewish men reclaiming their macho dignity through active aggression to make a point before being attacked. Essentially, it's the idea that the first day in prison, you must beat up the strongest guy there to make a point, so no one perceives you as vulnerable and attacks, but like with countries. Without getting too off track, you can absolutely see this mentality in the modern Gaza war as a backdrop to all the war crimes. Bomb us now! Bomb us now! How best to counter the psychology of the enemy? Maybe with a little bombast! Zionism ended up becoming a response to actual Nazism in providing a place of refuge during the Holocaust and a new future afterward. As a result, German Antifa has a minor but significant faction, anti-German Antifa, that holds the protection of Jews central to the anti-fascist praxis, and thereby supports Zionism as an extension of their opposition of Nazi Germany and its ideological descendants. While Antifa presents to the English-speaking world as solid, sprouting into existence in its one and final form like Athena from Zeus's brow, it actually has far more internal dissent than they let on. Even within the larger anti-imperialist Antifa faction that nominally opposes the State of Israel, support for Jews against anti-Semitism displayed by pro-Palestinian activists may lead its members to come to support Zionism, while nominally pro-Zionist groups may also be swayed to oppose Israel by its current administration's genocidal inclinations and numerous war crimes committed to appeal to a fascist voter base, the Kahanists. Such is the nature of a decentralized movement. In broad strokes, Antifa and Zionism can be considered roughly equivalent as sometimes allied anti-fascist movements. One Gentile, one Jewish, and both prone to violent toxic masculinity in the opposition of organized anti-Semitism. Within the perspective that Antifa just means any action one takes against fascism, Zionism absolutely applies as an anti-fascist action. Since I brought it up, I should probably plug one of the charities associated with the Israeli-Gaza conflict. I'd like to plug Standing Together, which has been engaging far-right Israeli thugs who are standing in the way of humanitarian aid entering Gaza. I believe this is in spirit of the general Antifa theme. I know BDS doesn't like them. I don't care. Anyway. Jewish men, pissed at the idea that they are inherently sissies by virtue of being Jewish, have historically embraced a form of hyper-masculine expression to push against the humiliation of being considered womanly, sissies, and nebbish. Israel specifically has the muscle Jews, but Jewish men generally living in a Gentile world may seek masculine success within it by embracing machismo. This is the context of Jack Kirby being a macho, manly man, prepared to beat the crap out of Nazis, embodying an ideal of masculinity through strength and the ability to inflict harm.
Every guy here'd love to be you, Gaston, even when taking your lumps.
Golden Age and Silver Age comics are full of the idea that it's cool when big, strong men assert dominance through violence. The Thing, Jack Kirby's persona, Soupsona, would regularly engage in public brawls to dominate the Yancey street gang and prove his masculinity, as they would often call him sissy or pantywaist. The trope of superheroes fighting each other exists because it was popular to pit them against each other to resolve conflicts through violence and show off their masculine prowess. Stan Lee was particularly fond of the term pantywaist to describe men who couldn't prove their masculinity through violent domination. The term references an outdated child's garment, shorts clipped to the shirt because they can't wear clothing right just yet, implying youthful incompetence in the strictest sense, but also connected to the idea that a man fails at being a real man, and is instead a sissy, a coward, womanly, and potentially gay.
You see, the trick is to make him look squat without making him look like a panty waist.
An early Spider-Man comic, The Amazing Spider-Man No. 8 from 1963, depicts Peter Parker truly ascending from his humble beginnings as a pathetic nerd by using his superpowers to win a boxing match with his schoolyard bully Flash. Because this is the Silver Age, a rampaging robot happens to distract Flash and make Peter accidentally perform an illegal move by striking someone looking away, but the fighting itself is portrayed as a good thing. If there hadn't been a random villain to gawk at, Peter would have creamed Flash honorably, and everyone would presumably be on his side for it. Peter is portrayed as someone who can't catch a break, thanks to random comics nonsense, but is fundamentally a boy who has matured through being able to physically overpower his bully. The boy became a man. A Spider-Man. This is all toxic masculinity. Comics don't get a pass just for being Jewish art. Jews can be sexist, and Jack Kirby and Stan Lee indisputably were. They were products of their time, and times have changed. The 2002 Spider-Man movie adapts Peter's fight with Flash, but changes the framing to a dishonorable hallway brawl. Peter is indicated to be in the wrong for sinking to Flash's level, He has the ability to dodge every punch, but Peter engages in Flash's toxic masculinity and beats him up. This is then framed as Peter becoming a bully, and Uncle Ben chews him out over it.
Just because you can beat him up doesn't give you the right to. With great power comes great responsibility.
This trend of responsible, non-toxic masculine idealism had been going on since the 70s. I think society really saw an improvement when The Karate Kid came out in 1984 and preached honorable fighting over fighting for the sake of mean-spirited domination.
Strike first, strike hard, no mercy, sir! I can't hear you!
All its various knockoffs then carried that message forward, saturating the culture with it. I'm particularly fond of one of the lines in the fourth movie in the franchise, 1994's The Next Karate Kid.
Fighting not good, but if must fight, win.
It makes sense to have the ability to fight and the honor to hold back until it becomes necessary to strike. 2002's Spider-Man follows this trend. Peter learns the lesson not to use power for mean-spirited domination, to use nonviolent conflict resolution whenever possible, but if must fight, win. 2012's Amazing Spider-Man echoes this depiction, with Flash given more of an empathetic portrayal as a bully who terrorizes people, but also someone who genuinely tries to show Peter compassion after Ben's death. Peter trying to reduce their relationship to physical domination is framed as him giving into anger and becoming like a bully himself. During Flash's actual bullying, Gwen Stacy diffuses the situation without violence, and is portrayed as a heroic figure. 2017's Spider-Man Homecoming doesn't have this kind of scene at all. Peter starts out better than his other incarnations for not needing to learn that violent domination of his peers is a bad thing, because the world he grows up in is much more progressive than for the other Peters. Flash also calls him Penis Parker instead of Puny Parker in this version, not mocking him on the same metric. Macho domination isn't a thing here. Sharp-witted feminist MJ commands the gender politics of the setting. Progressives ate this up. They were united in believing that physical domination as a heroic act was a relic of a worse era. And then this happened.
Kind of a symbol.
Anita Sarkeesian was celebrated by leftists for standing up to toxic men and criticizing cultural sexism, which included the idea that violent domination must be seen as a cultural value. Until someone punched Richard Spencer, and she, consistent with her feminist ideology, denounced that as a function of toxic masculinity. And leftists started calling her a fascist for it. Basically overnight, leftists decided that feminism wasn't a good idea if it meant challenging #AlwaysPunchNazis, and feminism was quietly amended to include it while temporarily canceling Anita Sarkeesian for supporting supposed fascist values. I actually saw her at a feminist event when that was going on and thanked her for sticking to her morals. Even if I didn't totally agree, there is value in promoting pacifism. Let's be clear here. Richard Spencer is an evil, evil man, preaching genocidal rhetoric. He must be denounced. Down with Spencer, down with Big Brother, down with fascism, no passer-on. Concurrently, I don't like the way that these 1920s toxic masculine values have been dredged up in the name of fighting fascism. As an anti-fascist, I get all my politics from Hitler. Every argument defending punching Nazis is based on how things worked back in the day, when everyone proved their manliness through street brawls to assert dominance. This includes the thing where Hitler speculated that utmost brutality from Antifa could have ended the Nazi movement before it took power. This is something members of Antifa frequently bring up in response to criticism of their #AlwaysPunchNazis, especially as a quick image macro on Twitter. On September 3rd, 1933, Hitler made a speech in which he used Darwinian language to make it seem like the Nazi success henceforth was because of evolutionary processes, making it the perfect organism for its environment. He also fell into some similar logic patterns as the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle is a creationist argument for God designing the universe for humanity, because slightly different conditions, if proteins were a little different, if Earth was too hot or too cold, etc., would render life impossible. Likewise, Hitler argued that Nazi success was found because slightly different conditions would have ended the Nazi movement before it could get off the ground. He identified two hazards that could have spelled disaster if they were slightly more extreme: Antifa resistance and Antifa ambivalence. According to him, if Antifa was super aggressive, they could have destroyed Nazism early on. But also, if they had done absolutely nothing in response, they wouldn't have hardened Nazism into the powerful entity it became. Only one danger could have jeopardized this development of the Nazi Party: if our adversaries had understood its principle, established a clear understanding of our ideas, and not offered any resistance. Or, alternatively, if they had from the first day annihilated with the utmost brutality the nucleus of our new movement. Neither was done. The more our adversaries believe they can obstruct our development by employing a degree of terror that is characteristic of their nature, the more they encourage it. Nietzsche said that a blow which does not kill a strong man only makes him stronger, and his words are confirmed 1,000 times. Every blow strengthens our defiance. Every persecution reinforces our single-minded determination, and the elements that do fall are good riddance to the movement. Adolf Hitler, 1933. Following Hitler's logic, it makes just as much sense to never punch Nazis. Every blow makes them stronger, right? It's certainly easier to never punch Nazis, and it's in line with following Hitler's blueprints to prevent the development of a powerful fascist movement. However, I would still caution people against following Hitler's advice, because he's Hitler. You don't get your advice from Hitler. I get the superficial attractiveness of the guy behind it all giving insight on how to prevent Nazism from again becoming powerful. It's like finding the plans to the Death Star weakness that blows up the whole thing. However, he's not a good source of information, and it's a lot closer to following the Emperor and attacking him or Vader to surrender to the dark side. God, I'm a nerd. Hitler's writings and orations were good at manipulating emotions, but he wasn't wise at all. He was just a paranoid bigot with power. He also talked about opposing an international conspiracy of Jews trying to undermine white Western civilization. If you say that we should support this conspiracy because Hitler knew what he was talking about, you're kind of just an anti-Semite attacking other anti-Semites. Him speculating about utmost brutality as one key to defeating Nazism falls into the same category as just something a fascist would say, because that's how they think. I also doubt he meant brawling so much as brown shirt paramilitary aggression, such as force-feeding people castor oil so that they would die in a humiliating, painful way, defecating themselves, as Mussolini did to his detractors prior to ascending to power. Punching Richard Spencer is not following Hitler's instructions to dominate people like a fascist. Claiming it's the same thing is an intellectually dishonest argument, trying to claim through argument from Der Führer authority that behaving like Antifa in the 20s is the way to go. Hitler has only got one ball. These various arguments about how it's necessary to abandon modern feminist values of pacifism and return to the brutal violence of a bygone era always feel like a bad father telling his son to not be a pussy. It also sounds a lot like a common Nazi talking point about the Jews acting through feminism and the gay rights movement to cause white Western culture to degenerate. Remember the good old days when men were men. Let's face it, World War II is endued with the quality of machismo. We see this all the time in entertainment like Captain America and Dunkirk. It's celebrated as a time of manly men, contrasted with the current generation, which is perceived by sexists to be weaker for being culturally androgynous, as gets them labeled with a misogynistic slur, pussies. And yeah, you do see this all the time with far-right memes about how strong, Chad-like, and Aryan white men were before the Jews used cultural Marxism and soy products to degenerate them. But the general sexist premise is everywhere, even without the Nazi part, even among those we might call anti-fascist. The song I used in the intro, speculating about the genitalia of the Nazi high command, was a popular British wartime ditty, probably best known in the modern day for being featured in an episode of Man in the High Castle. Hitler was the product of incest, and there is an unproven rumor that he was born with a single testicle, or perhaps lost it in a wartime injury. Bored members of the British Army extrapolated funny genitalia to other Nazis and sang a song about it. It is misogynistic, transphobic, and interphobic as hell, attacking men's physical masculinity as shorthand for their worth as human beings. It endures the test of time because it is cathartic for humiliating bad people, but it does so in a way that causes splash damage on anyone with non-standard genitalia and enforces toxic masculinity. The entire treatment of anti-fascist aggression is full of toxic masculinity, and, I have to say it, it's the elephant in the room, has some similarities to fascist ideology itself. When the Holocaust took place, toxic masculinity was the main way that men knew how to be men. This was prevalent in the Jewish community because men were all pushing against the anti-Semitic stereotype that they were all sissy pushovers, and not real men. Consequently, Jewish men wanted to punch the Nazis back, so to speak, to show their power through domination. Some did this in constructive, regulated ways, in which they helped the Allies in their war effort, Kissinger and Oppenheimer being notable examples of such. However, there was also Nakam, Hebrew for vengeance, full name meaning the Jewish people will have vengeance, sometimes translated as the Avengers, no relation to the superheroes. A Jewish terrorist organization that tried to do a reverse-Holocaust. Germany killed 6 million Jews, so about 250 Jews decided to kill 6 million Germans, indiscriminately, including those who had nothing to do with the Nazis, and may even have acted against them. Inside, I had a burning hatred against the Germans, against Germany. In my thinking, there is no innocent German. I dreamed at night, when I learned there was an atom bomb, that if I had the chance to drop it on Germany, I'd drop it. With my plan for vengeance, I wanted to tell the world that the remnant who remained after Auschwitz was capable of destroying the world. Take note. Next time it happens, the world perishes. Abba Kovner, leader of Nakam, 1984. Nakam members could cite the Torah verse about taking an eye for an eye with a particularly extremist interpretation and ignore the Torah verse condemning vengeance. But their psychologies, to me, reflect toxic masculine mindsets more than anything. Like, how could they as men live with the humiliation of not striking back? Would they not be sissies, panty waists, if they just took the domination like a woman taking sexual violence and then just moving on, without reclaiming their masculinity and violent domination? Yes, there were female members, but they fit into the same patriarchal paradigm, as all women may be criticized as exhibiting toxic masculine values themselves. Nakam talked a big game about acting pragmatically to defend Jews from future anti-Semitic aggression. Itself a problematic dude bro move, but they really cared about satisfying their vengeful desires. Other Jews wanted to build the state of Israel as a sanctuary for the vulnerable diaspora, and a deterrent against future attacks.
Fighting not good, but if must fight, win.
And most Holocaust survivors took pleasure in building communities and finding happiness in spite of the attempted genocide. The best revenge, living well. However, for the members of Nakam, the idea of moving on to build a new future was seen as a blow to the ego, in what we might call traditionally feminine passivity, as opposed to giving their lives in a furious sacrifice to a genocidal cause of revenge, in traditional toxic masculine violent action. Even though Zionism was partially about men reclaiming their dignity, building Israel wasn't enough for Nakam. They couldn't live with the humiliation of not reclaiming their dignity through violent domination. To me, this is clearly a reflection of gender values, of the idea of how to be a real man as opposed to being a sissy, and proving the anti-Semitic world right that Jewish men aren't real men by taking a too feminine route. Nakam attempted to poison a German city in their genocidal campaign, but a series of setbacks reduced their plans until they were caught by German authorities, and ultimately released back to Israel because of the extreme circumstances. Germany was undergoing denazification and was very forgiving of Holocaust survivors lashing out. A number of Nakam members went on to become members of Mossad and carried out state-sanctioned assassination of former Nazis, probably influenced by other former Nakam members operating within the Israeli government. We can imagine that they influenced Israeli state aggression, but that's just speculation. Their legacy continues in the Jews who think that Nakam did nothing wrong, that they should have succeeded, and that similar actions should be carried out against people that they can slot into the role of Nazis. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth.
Very good. That way the whole world will be blind and toothless.
That legacy is present in the glorification of punching Nazis, or people who can be slotted into the role of Nazis. The whole premise of, if a Nazi is present, punch him, has an aggressive, dehumanizing quality, akin to the hate exhibited by a Nazi himself. It reflects the spirit of Nakam, which was explicitly about inverting Nazism to punish Nazis. I don't put a high priority in the concern about Nazis themselves suffering per se. I'm no stranger to Schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude isn't very attractive, Laura, but so satisfying.
But I do care about values of honorable fighting over mean-spirited domination. True, if must fight, win, but I don't think genocidal rhetoric necessarily counts as a must-fight scenario. Nazis in the streets threatening to hurt people with actual physical violence is a must-fight scenario. Genocidal rhetoric is dangerous, but perhaps more akin to Flash swinging his fists. Time to dodge, while keeping the potential of violence in reserve in case they escalate.
We want to be civilized. I mean, you take a look at this trail here. Now, was that civilized? No, clearly not. Fun, but in no sense civilized.
Armchair abstraction. The defense that most anti-fascists make is that a Nazi promoting bringing in a Nazi regime that will perform genocide is itself a violent action. Richard Spencer talking about Pepe as a way to sell Nazism to the mainstream, while being politely interviewed on camera, represents the same threat as a Nazi brute stalking towards some Jewish kids with a lead pipe in his hands. Literally the same kind of violent threat that requires striking immediately as a deterrent. I need you to understand, this is not literally happening. This is an abstraction. It is not literally the same thing. Erasing the difference is objectively wrong. Spencer is literally just converting oxygen into carbon dioxide as he flaps his trap. Viewing it as literally the same thing as stalking towards a victim with a weapon is objectively false. It can be viewed as something similar, requiring a similar response to curb the spread of fascism, but lying about what's going on just confuses the matter. It is obfuscating rhetoric to say it's literally the same thing. Libertarians can do a very similar abstraction of the basic Mr. Miyagi philosophy that I think a lot of the people attracted to Antifa would object to. Libertarians can abstract violence to mean anything that results in the violence caused by the efforts of police to enforce laws, or the threat of such. If police are required to enforce the law against aggressing against other people or their property, then that is considered an acceptable use of violence or the threat of such. However, if laws are passed for basically any other purpose, a few real examples include a restriction on the amount of rat feces that can be found in food, keeping employers from sexually harassing employees, and reducing industrial pollution, they are seen to represent an unjust use of the threat of violence, equivalent to the literal act of aggression, that is reasonable to use literal violence or the threat of such to stop. So if people vote for someone who pushes a law that restricts littering, and then a racist cop decides to brutalize a black kid, under the pretense of littering, then, under this abstraction, his blood would be on the hands of everyone who voted. All laws are enforced with violence. The existence of police is to enforce laws with violence, or the threat of such, as could easily escalate into violence. Therefore, all people who cast votes are culpable for all acts of violence that go into the enforcement of laws that they wanted the government to adopt. The use of violence to restrict all laws down to the most necessary then becomes a moral obligation, as does a restriction on the people able to vote. So the only voters are the ones who vote for extreme deregulation. To allow actual democracy would be to allow police brutality in the enforcement of unnecessary laws. The general libertarian ideology is based around wild abstraction that results in staunch opposition to beneficial uses of government. You have to be able to recognize that this whole cult of abstraction is irrational. You have to be able to say, no, Laws with vague threats of violence and their implied enforcement aren't equivalent to someone literally hurting you now. Richard Spencer just talking now isn't equivalent to the potential horrific outcome of people listening to him and accepting a Nazi regime. The reasonable philosophy to not initiate violence shouldn't be distorted by such outlandish abstractions, and kept at its most basic form, in which case that Black Bloc protester must be understood as striking first, not responding to a threat of imminent violence. It is simply a brawl, playing to toxic masculine values of the 20s. Is it objectively funny? Yes. Is it civilized? No. Now, a justified use of Antifa violence would be that scene during the Unite the Right rally, in which heavily armed Nazis showed up to be intimidating. Antifa showed up to intimidate them back, and retaliated when the Nazis struck first, with imminent physical violence. That is a if must fight win scenario. They used violence only when the enemy first attacked them, or innocents, and were very measured in their violence. The whole thing is undesirable, but it demonstrates an acceptable use of force in extreme circumstances with a literal active threat. That is not the same thing as Richard Spencer just talking. That is also not the same thing as the Seattle Nazi harassing people but not using violence when an Antifa man punched him out cold, and another clip that went viral. In those cases, men use unprompted violent masculine domination, akin to the brawls of the 1920s, and then their fans call you a Nazi if you dare criticize it on social media. The implied threat being that if you're a Nazi, they'll have to punch you. After the left suddenly embraced toxic masculine domination in the case of punching Richard Spencer, it didn't stay confined to the opposition of Nazism. Seeing the left's positive reaction to this idea, Stephen Moffat had an episode of Doctor Who pander to them by having the Doctor punch a racist in the face.
Who let this creature in here? On your feet, girl! In the presence of your betters!
He's not a Nazi this time, just a run-of-the-mill, obnoxious, racist white guy shouting at a black woman. And people ate it up. The Doctor embraced toxic masculinity for a dramatic gesture, standing up for his friend's dignity, not her safety, just her dignity, and the left was totally on board. Now the Overton window has shifted. It's not that the Black Bloc protester was uniquely justified in punching Richard Spencer because of his genocidal rhetoric, it's that punching racists in general is a value in itself. Always punch Nazis, and also Nazi now means racist in general, and also no one can criticize it without being accused of defending Nazis and or racists in general. That is concerning in terms of maintaining ethical values, and presents a vulnerability where Nazis and other malicious agents can perform psyops to characterize progressive people as Nazis, and encourage unthinking aggression towards them, with any attempt to put the brakes on it, then earning one characterization of being a fascist collaborator, and thus becoming another target. That reflexive aggression toward anything resembling an enemy is not how the Doctor should act. It's how Daleks act. You know, the space Nazis, in their little space panzers.
Exterminate them! Exterminate! Exterminate! Exterminate!
In general, the left is against toxic masculinity. However, we have this weird relic from the 20s extending into modern day where big, strong men stand up for righteousness by violently dominating people. No one can criticize it without being called a Nazi, and it's already shown signs of influencing the surrounding culture. In 2020, the second season of The Boys featured a Nazi villain, Stormfront, who was opposed by a good guy with a punch to the face, in clear allusion to the man punching Richard Spencer. The subsequent beatdown the character receives is a tacit endorsement of always punching Nazis, which is justified in the scene because she's actually threatening to kill people. Outside the fiction, overly gung-ho viewers embrace the idea of being Antifa, and when they became enraged at the loathsome Nazi character on screen, they decided to take it out on Stormfront's actress, Aya Cash, a woman of obvious Jewish descent, if you ask me. Nevertheless, an Antifa cyber mob formed to harass her, convinced that a woman portraying a Nazi must be a white supremacist. Taking the proclamation to always punch Nazis to heart, they used cyberbullying tactics to hurt her across the internet, throwing out volleys of incendiary comments and DMs with the goal of making her quit acting. After convincing themselves that she was a Nazi, they earnestly tried to deplatform her as an anti-fascist action by essentially becoming Gamergate and doing their best to break her will. Under the broad definition of Antifa as anyone who opposes Nazis, these people absolutely were Antifa, following orders to deplatform Nazis by any means necessary, to smash the nucleus of the movement with utmost brutality, as best they could manage without being in the same room with her. And they heard an innocent woman they mistakenly identified as a Nazi, who is in fact a target of Nazi genocide efforts, and who was herself engaging in anti-fascist action through portrayal of a Nazi villain on an anti-fascist show, where the moral is to punch her. But can you really blame them? They were, after all, only following orders.
Can I make a suggestion that doesn't involve violence, or is this the wrong crowd?
Feminist anti-fascism. I have a question. What does God need with a starship? And why is it always punch Nazis? Why don't you hear about other fighting moves? I would argue that it's because punching is easy for men. A quick punch to the face to disable the opponent. It's in the common toxic masculine advice to stop bullies.
He said, be a man. Just pop him in the mouth once, son, and he'll back off.
Because we're talking about men fighting men, and the occasional Nazi woman. Not women fighting men, or even women fighting women. That's why we never hear about Antifa members using female self-defense moves.
Solar plexus, instep, nose, right!
Or even something from a gender-neutral martial art like Krav Maga, the Israeli martial art that enables women to be active fighters in the Israeli Defense Force.
Tell me at least you two pack some heat.
I know Krav Maga. I am a weapon.
We're talking about big, strong men engaging in street violence to assert dominance over other men, while women stick to non-combative roles, or in some cases, sublimate themselves into traditional masculinity to fight as men do. Though some women may find that empowering, these aren't, strictly speaking, feminist gender roles. This is Spider-Man from the Silver Age comics, and it doesn't have to be. Since patriarchy is systemic in Western society, and all of us are socialized to accept sexism as the norm, anti-fascist movements are not immune from sexism and misogyny. We reject macho anti-fascism as yet another expression of sexist and patriarchal culture and an oversimplification of a complex political struggle. We acknowledge and celebrate all forms of anti-fascist work, and not just violent action, which is often excessively romanticized and fosters macho anti-fascism. Anonymous Irish Fantifa member. Principles for Feminist Anti-Fascism, 2020. Modern American Antifa is aping the Antifa of Weimar Germany and ignoring its feminist counterpart, Fantifa. I have only seen the slightest allusion to the fact that Fantifa exists from modern American Antifa. The Antifa International Tumblr account has briefly mentioned a purple-themed feminist variant of Antifa, with no detail as to what's different about it. Mark Bray mentioned it in his Anti-Fascist Handbook a few times, but likewise didn't go into great detail. Mountain Road by Al Stotts, an obscure work of fiction, briefly has an anarchist woman describe an American Fantifa group, but I doubt it's based on an actual group operating in America. The author probably got it from the Anti-Fascist Handbook. I also saw a Welsh guy on Quora saying that Fantifa is a contraction of fake Antifa to represent ideas that Nazis pretend are anti-fascist, like that you shouldn't punch Nazis, as a troll campaign, which might be a misunderstanding, but strikes me as a deliberate attempt to defame the actual Fantifa movement, so that all of their arguments are dismissed in advance, as Nazi attempts to kneecap Antifa instead of a legitimate dissenting movement within Antifa. And that's basically all America has of Fantifa. Few obscure notes that they exist, and a lie that they're fascists. The accusation of fascism against female activists results from a masculine framework in the dichotomy of friend and foe, which structures patriarchal society in terms of both domestic and foreign policy. The accusation of fascism against demanding women and active victims can only be understood from a fearful male mindset, which is otherwise completely untenable and lacks any socio-political analysis and reflection. The accusation of fascism against feminists and lesbians is therefore a particular variant of modern misogynistic behavior. Thea A. Structemeyer. Feminism and Fascism, Different or Not? Schwarzer Faden, Black Thread, 1990. Self-translated from German. Up until recently, when I started the Wikipedia page for it, there was virtually no English coverage of fantifa. So when I ran across the reference to it in the handbook, I had to delve into German sources to look it up. Turns out, a lot of the same issues I have with Antifa, female members of German Antifa had them too. And they did something about it. Almost 40 years ago. 1980s German Antifa was sexist as hell. Literally thought the feminist movement was of Nazi origin, and thereby in their purview to smash. And Fantifa had to run a PR campaign throughout the 90s to get the word out that they weren't fascist. There's this wild 1990 article in an anarchist magazine called Feminism and Fascism, Different or Not? That goes through the usual, we hate patriarchy, not men spiel, but also talks about Nazis because there was a fascist woman from 1934 who preached for Nazi tolerance of butch women within the Nazi movement, and German anarchists at the time were citing her as evidence that feminism itself was fascist. Things we take for granted, like an understanding that Nazis oppressed women and feminists would reasonably oppose them, had to be spoon-fed to men's Antifa groups point by point. I have to stress this. Male Antifa groups literally believed that the anti-feminist characterization of the feminist movement as, to use the Rush Limbaugh term, feminazis, was totally on point. They literally believed that feminists hate men and are equivalent to Nazis hating Jews. They literally believed that women criticizing Antifa groups as sexist was equivalent to a Nazi attack on Antifa integrity. Not just in an if you're not with us, you're against us way, but because they held that patriarchal values were essential to being anti-fascist, and feminist values were a form of being fascist. As a result, they saw the feminism in their midst as equivalent to a Nazi attempt to destabilize the anti-fascist movement and try to destroy feminism. Feminist Antifa members had to form their own Fantifa movement and walk men through why feminism didn't literally equate to Nazism, holding them by the hand as they explained point by point. Even with the disclaimer I made at the front of this video, I'm sure that my extensive criticism of toxic masculinity in Antifa is going to get me labeled a secret Nazi trying to destabilize Antifa through babbling pretentious academic nonsense. I mean, after all, Hitler said that we should all strike with utmost brutality, and that's a man who knows how to not be a Nazi, right? I'm sure that me saying, don't get your political philosophy from Hitler, would be seen as somehow being a Nazi. Because see, I'm criticizing Antifa, and being anti-Antifa logically makes one pro-fa. So everyone will want to denounce me for saying not to be a Nazi because that makes me a Nazi. Or maybe you just want an excuse to be a bully on the internet, and the semblance of fighting Nazis confers a sense of justice while doing so. Anyway, it fits into a historical pattern of members of Antifa opposing feminists as Nazis. Just that Germany went through the upheaval of such social issues in the 90s, and America is lagging behind. Once Fantifa established that they weren't Nazis, they addressed systemic sexism in men's Antifa groups. An early focus was making daycare a commonplace feature at Antifa meetings, thus allowing women with children the ability to participate, instead of the men participating while the women stay home. They called out the excessive machismo exhibited by men, talking over women, being domineering, not sharing information that men share with each other, standard sexism stuff in the context of the anti-fascist movement. If men deny the existence of patriarchy and its structures, we women have to ask ourselves where the boundaries are between fascist and non-fascist men. As long as men who describe themselves as anti-fascists do not face these questions and close their minds to a discussion about patriarchy, we women will assume they are aware of the possibility of being fascist. Clara, member of a Fantifa group in southern Germany, quoted in Fantifa, Feministische Perspektiven antifaschistischer Politik. Feminist Perspectives on Anti-Fascist Politics, 2013, self-translated from German. Okay, but my long diatribe about toxic masculinity isn't the same, right? I'm attacking the anti-fascist movement and thereby empowering fascism, right? Well, no. Fantifa addressed that too, in 1990s Germany. In the 1990s, we were annoyed by the men who were from the on-the-mouth faction and their street-fighting mentality, as if this were the solution to structural social problems. For us, violent direct action against other human beings, whether male or female Nazis, was an idea we did not want. Clara, same source. Fantifa overtly criticized Antifa men punching Nazis as a display of excessive machismo, which Fantifa deemed ineffective at subverting fascism and to display the same toxic masculinity of fascism itself. They actually worked out a system where some activists would be trained in Wendo, a women's self-defense martial art, and they'd protect the untrained members from Nazis by forming a defensive perimeter and make a point of not striking first. If Nazis attacked, Fantifa would defend themselves and others, but they followed the rule of the next Karate Kid.
Fighting not good, but if must fight, win.
They also criticized Antifa men punching Nazi women as a form of violence against women. I can see where they were coming from. These Antifa men really were sexist as hell. In addition to the stuff I talked about, there was a whole rape scandal where an Antifa man was a rapist, Fantifa insisted he be blacklisted, and a lot of the Antifa men defaulted to this being proof that feminism was antithetical to the anti-fascist movement. There was a whole blow-up over it in 2000 and 2001. Then Fantifa kind of petered out as Nazis became less relevant in the wake of 9/11. And they made a comeback in the 2010s when modern intersectional feminism made its way to Germany. I honestly have a lot of issues with the politics of 90s Fantifa, which were grounded in second-wave radical feminism, but modern Fantifa is kind of amazing. They have the whole thing of protesting Nazis, bonded with Take Back the Night, and they're outstandingly transpositive. They totally understand how TERFs are promoting Nazi ideology and stand up on behalf of trans and intersex people. They have an acronym of the people they stand for, kind of like how we have LGBT, except theirs is FLINTA, F-L-I-N-T-A. Frauen, women, lesbians, intersex people, non-binary people, trans people, and agender people, all identified as allies against patriarchy. I've learned on their forums and what they call transphobic controversies within the movement I wish were all we dealt with in the English-speaking feminist world. These days, Fantifa is kind of a big deal in leftist Germany. In the Me Too era, many Antifa men are now on Fantifa's side. There's a German protest slogan that goes like, high kick, low kick, Fantifa, feminism, shalala. Fantifa has a flag. There are now Fantifa groups outside of Germany. Not in the US though, as far as I can tell. In the US, we get always punch Nazis. This is what we did in the 20s. Read this quote from Hitler. Always get your political advice from Hitler. And face him like a man, son. So why don't we have Fantifa? We have organized Antifa groups that are decentralized, but share the same general culture as German Antifa. Surely they would know about it. And, well, it seems to me that the answer must be that they know about it and mostly have deliberately decided to obscure it from popular knowledge instead of promoting it as an intersectional framework for addressing the fascist problem. Though German Antifa has made peace with working in an environment that includes Fantifa, it seems probable to me that all that entrenched sexism never really went away, and when seeding a more conservative country, the US, with Antifa groups, they took the opportunity to make it patriarchal, passively deciding not to reproduce what they probably saw as an annoyance, a problematic part of their local politics. I would like to make a distinction between Antifa and anti-fascism. Antifa is a particular entity, and it shouldn't be the only one. We need Fantifa, and probably several others. I think it's clear that Antifa, no matter how we define it, has a problem with toxic masculinity. Even as it has heightened awareness of fascist threats, it's also made America worse in some ways. It's brought toxic masculine ideals to the forefront and said that if you challenge it at all, that makes you a fascist. Well, Fantifa went through that 30-40 years ago. It's high time we do it here. There are other ways to oppose Nazis. They want a glorious battle. Don't appease their machismo. undercut it. Refraining from unnecessary violence needn't be considered capitulation to fascism. Our appeal also goes to men. Comrades, intervene when you see sexism. Develop a pro-feminist self-image. Carry this into your personal life and your circles of friends. Show solidarity with women and queer people. We will remain, we will stay loud, and we will never give in. Antifa and feminism belong together. Anonymous Fantifa member. Fit for Fantifa magazine, issue 1, 2020. Self-translated from German. As for me, I'm raising the flag. High kick, low kick, Fantifa. Feminism, shalala.
I'm gonna tell you